Now, 50 years ago, a group of visionary educators came together from across the Stanford community to address a really important question. How do you train students to think both deeply and flexibly about the complicated problems facing humanity? Their answer was the educational program that we all know as human biology, and it was unlike any that had been created before. The very foundation of that education, the HumBio core, was envisioned even at the beginning as a set of interlocking courses incorporating disciplines across the biological and social sciences. So we thought, what better way to start our series of celebrations than with an event focused on the educational experience that all HumBio students across the years share, the HumBio core.
So it's fitting today to start off our question and answer with our faculty member, Dr. Paul Fisher, who has seen the core from the perspective as a student, head TA, an instructor, and also the former program director.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of a unique perspective, and I think I'll probably start for the alumni and the nostalgia train for the evening. I would give a reference to Don Kennedy, one of HumBio's founders, and I think many of the alumni will remember that Don would start the core each year, and he gave a lecture. The lecture title, I went back and looked, Understanding Life, Unity and Diversity, and it was basically a lecture regarding constancy and changes on an evolutionary scale. I'm amazed how much of what I teach now was completely unknown when I was a student in the core back in the 80s. So clearly there's a lot of evolution, but I think the faculty nurture this evolution, and in the end, they always want to make sure that it's current and present for the student today, that the skills they get are lifelong.
I guess you asked me that question because I have the longest perspective. Been here a long time. One of my oldest memories, and the most indelible, was the first day of what was then HumBio 1, a prelude to the core. The first day featured Colin Pittendrigg, an imposing figure. The lecture hall was reverberating with excitement and conversation, as it always is on the first day of the quarter. Pitt, as we called him, entered the room and walked pensively back and forth. The room gradually quieted and silenced. Then he would say, "Two things have happened on this planet: the evolution of DNA and the evolution of language. Those remain major themes of HumBio."
So pretty much all of my lectures had at least a little bit about COVID or the coronavirus in there. On the very first day of the core, when I introduced myself, I said that when I was about the age of our current students, the world was in the grips of another pandemic. So it took about 5 years to having a diagnostic test to identify the causative agent that causes AIDS. And in the case of the current pandemic, that took about 4 weeks. And so I tried to share with the students, what's changed in science and how that rapid progress has been possible. The good news on the phase 3 trials came just right at the end of the course. So the very last lecture was in part a review of the vaccine that now is being rolled out. And hopefully we'll get us all back to normal pretty soon.
I really emphasize the conceptual thinking and retention. I want students to remember the concepts and how to put them together and then retain the knowledge and the process. And in doing so, I think telling human stories is really important. I tell a story of the physician Semmelweis, who was the one that saved many women's lives during childbirth by convincing people to wash their hands. And I hope that when my students are out there and they're acting as physicians and they're washing their hands, they remember Semmelweis and think about being more empathetic and kind to their patients.
In the core, we have to give students the background that they need to go on to many different upper level kind of trajectories, whether they be in traditional basic science or whether they're in social science or whatever. We have to have breadth, but at the same time, we have to have depth. So for example, Roel Nusse gives 2 lectures on the cell cycle, and the students think they're learning about the cell cycle. But really underneath that, they're learning about how you can do a genetic screen to identify the parts list of a process you don't know anything about. They're learning about how mechanisms of phosphorylation and modification of proteins can regulate their action. They're learning about program degradation of proteins can make a process go one way and not backwards and not the other. So they're really learning many fundamental lessons when they think they're learning about the cell cycle.
So yeah, I teach in 3B, environmental and health policy analysis. And in a way, I see our part of the core, which I teach with Professor Joe Nation, who's here. So it's a kind of a team effort that we do. So I see our part of the core as helping students understand the ways that societies, as developed, make decisions and take actions that are collective, talking about individual freedom versus more centralized decision-making and policies. When can we use markets, free market concepts, let all the doctors and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies kind of do what they want, as opposed to needing regulation to get the outcomes that we really like. And then within that, we look and try to find specific things, maybe sometimes economic analysis. So we teach some costs and benefits and supply and demand, which are generalizable tools. We look at equity tools. How can you think about an equitable distribution, which is something that has become more important in my teaching in the core lately.
So for instance, I've long been doing a kind of mini series on disease and society, how societies in the past responded to certain kinds of infectious diseases like plague and smallpox and TB. And sometimes you get the sense that students think, well, this is all very interesting, but how is this actually still relevant? And I think, well, this question has now been conclusively settled in the last 12 months, unfortunately, right? And that ties in with another big theme of many of my lectures, which is the very long, the very deep history of inequality, especially economic inequality in terms of the distribution of income and wealth. Because I'm convinced we can't understand the current conditions, the current challenges that we face now in this respect without having a sense of what the underlying dynamics and long-term patterns were. And they are quite easy to track. I mean, they can be tracked back from ancient times all the way into the present. And of course, it wouldn't be HumBio if I wasn't trying to link this to the biology of the human body, how these inequalities manifest in actual human beings in terms of stature, of well-being, of morbidity, of differences in life expectancy. And again, some of these metrics can be traced back over hundreds or sometimes thousands of years. And I think it's very important to show how deeply rooted these inequalities are in human societies, in human civilization.
So the challenge is we want to teach about fundamental biological processes in a way that is current and yet in some sense timeless. So I decided to focus particularly on rapid adaptation. I think most people have this sense of evolution taking place over geological timescales. But there are many clear examples and many clearly relevant examples to today of very rapid evolution. So one example I teach about is an amazing visual experiment where they made an agar plate that was 6 feet wide, embedded antibiotics in the agar plate at the various concentrations. And then over the course of maybe 2 weeks, they can evolve bacteria that are capable of withstanding antibiotic concentrations almost 10,000-fold higher than they would normally ever encounter or be able to survive. So I want the students to understand that adaptation and evolution can be an extraordinarily rapid process. And I think what we're seeing now with COVID, with the variants that are emerging in South Africa and the UK, makes it clear that such rapid adaptation has clear ramifications for humanity itself.
Yeah, there's new stuff coming along. And the best example is, of course, the coronavirus and the aspect of becoming immune against the viral infection. And I have been indeed adapting my lectures to teaching those topics. And what happens then is something that I always find quite remarkable. You have a whole lot of rather vague knowledge, mostly picked up from the newspaper, the New York Times, and then you have to put it together into a lecture. And then suddenly you see that, first of all, you didn't know much yourself to begin with. But you also start to realize that in order to convey that to the students in a way that hopefully is going to be comprehensible to the students, you have to really dig deep into the nature of how that virus actually replicates. And I didn't really know that before I gave my lecture. And hopefully I was able to convey to the students how it actually works. And hopefully in a few weeks, when I'm going to talk about how you make a vaccine, I will be able to do the same.
For me, one of the most important skills that we can teach our students is effective communication of science, natural science on the A side, social science on the B side. Now, on the A side, given what we teach, we could just give the students some, kind of standard problems in genetics and population biology, ecological modeling, and they could learn the rules to plug and chug their calculations. And they get practice in that. But for our writing assignments, what we do is we design a problem like that actually lets them use their calculations or their analysis to discover something or predict something. And then we kind of wrap that in a scenario and ask them to write about what they have found, to write about their results for a specific imagined audience.
So I always start off by emphasizing that democracy is not a spectator sport. One of the things that I'm a big fan of is memo writing. It's really important, I think, to be able to succinctly, convincingly argue a position in one page. And one of the reasons it's so important to get to the point and to be convincing is that, certainly from my experience, most politicians have attention spans of about a minute or so. So students write that one-page memo, and then as a hook, effectively, and then they come back and they do a longer team-written memo, several pages long, and they can delve into it. Because whether someone ends up as an MD or a movie producer or whatever they end up doing out of the HumBio program, I think it's really important that they are an active participant. And I think that these skills that they acquire will really help them in whatever they do.
What I'd like to talk about in a nutshell is the poster project, really with the input of a lot of the faculty, CAs, and the staff. To the point now, it emphasizes development of 5 major skills. Condense a lot of information into an effective communication, both in an oral format and in a written format. Convey that you're an expert on the topic that you're presenting on. How to entertain criticism and comments and questions about the topic that you're presenting. And then lastly, there's a written component where you write, in essence, seeking funds to continue the activity. What are gaps in our knowledge? What were limitations of the approach that the presentation of the paper that you presented raised, and so forth. So you can see all these skills, while they are definitely focused from a scientific perspective, I think they're general skills that apply in many different aspects of careers that I think HumBio prepares students to fulfill. Thanks, Annette.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all the faculty. That sort of concludes our panel discussion.